Hello everybody, welcome to TYT Community. Thank you for joining us, and here with me is my esteemed co-host Jeff Waldorf and Brad from bradblog.com, and I am your host Rhiannon Avaneen. And I believe right now we are going to talk about Texas as the new battleground that a grassroots movement started by Jeremy Bird is trying to paint the state blue. Jeff, what do you know of this?
Not actually. This is the first that I've heard about this, but I do know that there's going to be some difficulties in the way of turning Texas blue, and I don't see it happening at least until way after 2016. And of course, it definitely involves the Hispanic population. As we know, the Hispanic population is growing, but that doesn't necessarily mean eligible voters, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the Democrats can turn up the vote. Now let's open it up.
Right. There are some facts that I just wanted to throw out there. One of the reasons that Jeremy Bird started this grassroots movement in the first place is because he happened upon some statistics, including that only 35% of Hispanic voters turn out in any given election on average. And also there is a considerable lack of women and black voters in Texas that turn out for the elections. So his effort is trying to get these people out to the polls to vote and make it easier for them to vote.
And, you know, this is why it is so important, and I know we're going to talk about it in a bit, the Voting Rights Act and what we saw at the Supreme Court this week, but that's what that fight is about. That fight to keep people from voting in places like Texas. The Texas legislature realizes at this point that the only way they're going to continue to win elections down the road is if they stop people from being able to cast their vote. And when folks come down there and start, registering people to vote, starts getting out the Hispanic vote, the African American vote, the days of the Republican Party are numbered. And it's really interesting because we're seeing the exact same thing that we sort of saw, 50 years ago prior to the signing of the Voting Rights Act, when it was absolutely about keeping people from being able to register to vote. And that's what, and people were killed, by the way, out there trying to register people to vote down in Mississippi. That eventually led to the Voting Rights Act that we have today, and that Republicans are trying to kill today. But that's what you're seeing with all of these restrictions in places like Texas on registration and on voting. They know which way things are going. They know that the demographics are working against them. Period. So instead of coming up, with what you and I would do, coming up with policies and shit that people might like to vote for, instead it's let's just keep people from voting. That's the plan. That's what they're trying to do, and that's why this fight for voting rights is so important, even today and this week in particular.
No, that actually brings up a really good. It makes me think of something. Remember that video was probably about 20, 30, 40 years old, something like that, of where the guy had said, "We don't want people to vote. We don't." I forget the name of the guy who made that video, but it was
Paul Weyrich was his name. 1980. We don't want people to vote. The more people that turn out to vote, the more people that vote, the higher our I forget the exact quote now, but our leverage in election goes up. The fewer people that come out and vote. That was Paul Weyrich. He was the conservative demigod. He only died a year or two ago, and up until then, by the way, he would have weekly meetings with the entire right wing, with all of the muckety-mucks in the right wing. That speech, and you can certainly find it at bradblog.com. We've reposted it over and over again if you look up Paul Weyrich. But that speech I consider to be sort of the Rosetta Stone for modern-day Republican voter suppression. That's what this is about. Their leverage goes up when the voting populace goes down. That was the exact words that he used, and that's what this is about. And again, instead of coming up with policies that people might like, they just want to keep the voting populace down. That's been, frankly, it's nothing new. That has been their something that they've been doing now for decades, if not longer. But it's kicking into gear again as they're seeing the writing on the wall, as they're seeing the demographic writing on the wall.
So what do you all see about the challenges of trying to get those people in Texas to start voting? I mean, other than, of course, the obvious attempts at voter suppression.
Right, exactly. They have to somehow combat the voter suppression that they're seeing from the right and their blatant attempts to keep minorities from going to the polls by changing voting hours, by restricting your ability to vote from home. That's one of the things they tried to do here in Ohio last time is Republicans tried to end the vote through mail process entirely. It didn't work, luckily, but they tried. And that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind, that these people are working often all daylight hours and can't get to the polls. Some of them need rides, some of them just don't have the time, so they need access such as voting through the mail. There are even some proposals by some Democratic legislators to start a voting process online, which might help.
Actually, it would be an absolute nightmare to have voting online. That's the last thing you want to do. Internet voting is absolutely insane. And by the way, so is voting by mail, unless you absolutely have to, unless you can't get to the polls. The real concern in Ohio, I mean, well, there's a lot of concerns in Ohio, but in this past election, one of the grave dangers was restricting early voting, which, by the way, is also not a great idea unless you can't, unless you can't get there on a Tuesday, which is a work day. And if you're in a state like Ohio with the Secretary of State like John Husted, who wants to make the lines as long as possible and make it as difficult as possible for people to vote. Yeah, they have been restricting voting in places like Ohio. But just be careful. Don't do online voting, please. We have enough trouble right now overseeing the results of our elections and ensuring that they are accurate. If you have internet voting, it is 100% unverifiable. You will never, ever, ever know if anybody ever won any election legitimately ever again. So that's internet voting. When it comes to vote by mail, the reason you can go to bradblog.com and we've written a bit about this. If you look up vote by mail is a terrible idea for democracy, you'll see some reasons why. But, among them, talk about black box voting, man. You drop your ballot in a post office box, good luck. It either gets there or it doesn't. It either gets counted once it's there or it doesn't. And who knows if it's ever counted accurately. But, I don't mean to poo-poo what your general point here, Rhiannon, which is that if people cannot vote on a Tuesday in a work day, particularly when lines, as they were in Ohio, once again this year, were 2, 4, 6, 8 hours to cast your vote, then yeah, you do have to do something, and absentee, vote by mail or early voting needs to be there at least as an option. But we've just got to make it easier to vote on Election Day.
Absolutely, I think that voting by mail needs to be there as an option. It's absolutely necessary. I've thought about that before. My ballot could get lost in the mail, but there are people who are infirm, elderly people especially, who simply cannot get out of their house, and the mail voting system is just absolutely essential. And I don't know if it was just locally in my area now that I think about it, but they were trying to end the vote by mail system as well as the voting early system, which often is the same, is a similar process. And they were also trying to change the voting hours,
right,
in this particular area to make it as inconvenient for people as possible.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what that's what John Husted was doing. And by the way, I had given him great credit early on when he came in. He was instrumental, frankly, in blocking the Republicans' plan for a polling place photo ID restriction in Ohio. So I gave him a lot of credit early on, because he bucked his own party to do that. But then as we got closer and closer to the election, he got worse and worse and more partisan, and he started restricting early voting hours, specifically restricting voting in the last 3 days before the election, which is when the Sunday before the election, when a lot of African Americans turn out to vote during their Souls to the Polls program. That was specifically something that John Husted was trying to stop in Ohio. And by the way, at the same time, while he was shutting down early voting 3 days before the election, for everybody else, he was allowing military voters to vote in those 3 days before the election. So he couldn't claim that this was done, because it was too chaotic in those days before the election. You had to get ready. They had to, keep the polls closed. He couldn't claim that because the polls were going to stay open. The early voting locations were going to stay open for active duty military. And by the way, only active duty military. Veterans, go to hell. He didn't care about them. Only active duty military could vote in those last 3 days, and that's why the Obama administration went to court, sued to stop that. The Republicans pretended that Obama was suing to stop the active duty military from being able to vote in those last 3 days. But what Obama was doing was suing to say that everybody should be able to vote in those last 3 days. And luckily, he won. Obama won that particular case. So we had more voting rights instead of less, which takes you back to your original point of Republicans trying to keep people from voting.
I want to kind of change gears a little bit and ask you about how, because we have a voter apathy problem as well, and I'm wondering, especially when it comes to the Latino community in those southern states where you have the Voting Rights Act, how do you get those people out to the polls? What do you do?
Right. Only 35% of Hispanics coming out to vote is a very depressing number, and Jeremy Byrd felt the same way, and he thought if he can get most of Hispanics to come out and vote, you could change the dynamics of the politics in Texas and make it a battleground state, in that politicians would have, presidential candidates would have to fight for Texas in order to win the election, much as they do for Ohio and Florida now.
Now, do you think that immigration? Do you guys think that immigration reform is their attempt to try and, because you're seeing Republicans starting to back up immigration reform, and do you think that's a way to that the two parties are now fighting over immigrants, the Latino vote?
I think that Republicans are trying to appease the Hispanics a little bit and seem a little bit less anti-Hispanic. I think they're trying to appeal to them, because I think that they're one of the few groups of people that Republicans have some sort of hope of winning over at some point. Which Republican was it that said recently on I think it was Fox News, that Hispanics should be Republican because they're usually family-oriented and religious people? Probably.
Well, actually, it's a right-wing talking point that they've had for years, saying that the Hispanics are our natural constituency. Right. It's a bullshit line, frankly, and I think, Rhiannon, I think you're absolutely right. It's not about winning their vote. It's about stopping the bleeding. They have been absolutely, telling the Hispanic community to go to hell for the last 5-10 years at least. And they're getting their asses killed. And the fact of the matter is, unless they can stop the bleeding of Hispanic voters who are growing in size yet shrinking as a proportion of the Republican vote, the Republicans realize they're dead in the water. So no, they don't give a damn about Hispanics, other than they realize if they don't stop pissing them off, they will never, ever, ever win another election ever again.
I think they're genuinely afraid because they don't don't have the woman vote and the majority of the woman vote. They don't have the majority of the black vote at all. They're running out of rich white men to gather to their forces. So if they don't win over some minority or some other demographic, then they are going to die as a political party.
And then here come the tokens. You've got your Ted Cruz. You've got your Marco Rubio. I mean, come on. You know, they're going to bring out these tokens on Fox News and say, look, we're Latinos and we're conservatives. We have those family values and fiscal conservatism that you should come to embrace. Those liberals are bringing you down.
Are you saying their efforts are hypocritical and they don't really mean it, Jeff?
Oh, I would never say such a thing.
I hope not. I hope not. I hope you would not question their motives.
You know, it just totally reeks of 100% hypocrisy, and that's what all that we've seen come out of the Republican Party as of late. And they're heading towards an implosion. If it already hasn't happened.
You sound kind of excited about that, Jeff.
Oh, maybe.
Uh-huh. Actually, you know, because I've heard a lot of people say that, oh, I can't wait for the Republican Party to die. You know, I would sort of make a counter-argument. I don't think it actually helps for there to be such a weak Republican Party right now and such a crazy Republican Party right now. I think it actually helps the process. I think it helps actually the progressive cause for there to be a legitimate Republican Party rather than the crazy off the rails Republicans that we have now. And I'll sort of give you one example of that. Obamacare, the health care bill, because the whole idea of what we ended up doing with the this market-based solution was initially a Republican idea. And it came out of the Heritage Foundation. It was used, the bill, pretty much the bill that we the mandate bill that we eventually settled on, that came out of as a response to the Clintons' healthcare proposal back in the 90s. So because there was no vigorous argument for a Republican version of healthcare reform, what you had was the Democrats sort of moving to the center and trying to find consensus on their own, bargaining with themselves, adopting the position of the Republicans. Now, if you had the Republicans actually putting forward the mandate idea as their own idea, you might have had the Democrats on the other side talking about single payer, and maybe you would have ended up in the middle with a public option. But because there was no legitimate argument on the right, you just had the Democrats moving all the way over to the right and eventually, adopting the Republicans' plan. And the Republicans were actually able to throw up their hands and say, oh, my God, this mandate, it's outrageous, it's tyranny.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
The fact that the right is so far, far, far to the right actually ends up pulling the Democrats across the line to the right as well.
Right. Well, when Obama... And you've seen this a lot. Obama's a centrist Democrat, okay? He's very centrist, even center-right. And so when he proposes right-wing plans, because he thinks that, oh, hey, they'll agree with this. They'll get this done, and I can have my legacy. It's all about building that legacy, right? So he goes and proposes their own plans, and, of course, they have nowhere to go except further right. And then suddenly you're hearing tyranny, Marxism, socialism, communism. Dude, those were your ideas.
Yeah, because there's no real competition for ideas, and competition is good, as in, legitimate competition in capitalism, but legitimate competition in politics as well, in the arena of ideas. And because there is no competition, because you've got sort of one party off in la-la land, talking about the mandate is tyranny and will enslave us all, you don't really have a legitimate debate. And that's what's missing, and I would argue that that is not good in truth for progressive ideals ultimately, as much as people love to see the idea of the Republican Party crashing and burning eventually, as it will.
Well, see what we're thinking is actually when the Republican Party implodes, it's not just going to completely fall apart. It's going to splinter up into smaller factions. I could see a libertarian faction that will eventually start gaining steam, because some of the libertarian ideas are actually incredibly popular, because it casts off that that religious fundamentalist aspect of the Republican Party and goes, we're hip, we're with it. Go ahead and smoke your weed. Go ahead and have a gay marriage. And by the way, I want to cut your taxes. That's a popular message, especially for people my age, people that are in the tech business, people that are approaching middle class or in middle class. They're like, yeah, I want low taxes too. And then you're going to have the crazy fringe, that party that's going to cast off, that's going to collect all of those religious conservatives,
the Tea Party.
Yeah, and then I think whoever is left, I think will coalesce, I think, into a more moderate Republican Party, if that doesn't happen with the libertarian wing, which could very well happen, in my opinion.
Well, I think that we need to wrap this up and go ahead with final thoughts. Jeff, you start.
Like I said in the beginning, I don't think Texas is going to turn blue anytime soon. I think immigration reform, once again, is just kind of a ploy to try and boost the Hispanic vote. I don't necessarily know if it's going to win. The jury is out on that one, but I do applaud them for trying. I think it's a great idea, especially to get more people out to vote, because we need more people out to vote. We are so apathetic when it comes to our rights as the citizen, and nobody seems to really understand that it's their right. When you talk to some regular people and go, did you vote today on November 6th? Did you vote today? What for? Why bother? They're both the same. And so really more education. We need to educate people, and we do actually need to have more progressive choices, because right now it's between evil and lesser evil.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm glad you made that point, because that's the key here. I don't know that it's apathy so much as people think their vote doesn't matter. They don't know if it's counted. They don't know if it's counted accurately. That's a very serious concern that we've been covering for years, obviously at bradblog.com. But Democrats need to give people something to vote for. They need to give them a reason. They need to give them more of a reason than, oh, well, we're not those guys, because those guys are crazy and we're not them. That's not a positive message that gets people out to the polls. And so I think a lot of the apathy is exactly as you say, because there's sort of both parties, while they are by no means the same, they're both kind of the same in many ways, and Democrats don't get out there and sell a real progressive message to get people fired up, to get to the polls, to actually change this country.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. The Democratic Party is feeling less and less like the progressive party we need it to be. We need an actual progressive party in this country, and I don't feel like we actually have one anymore.
They are the corporate establishment now.
But
they're the corporate establishment party.
But I am very much supportive of Jeremy Bird and his attempt at trying to paint Texas blue, and I don't know if he's going to be successful or not. But certainly his efforts will not be in vain. If we can get more people out to vote, then it will have been worth it. So I'm going to wrap this up and say thank you very much for joining us on this episode of TYT Community, and please join us again.
Brad, where can we find you, man?
Find me at bradblog.com, or more conveniently, you can find me on the Twitters at TheBradBlog and at the Facebook at TheBradBlog.
And you can find me at facebook.com/LadyRhiannon824 or Twitter at LadyRhiannon824. And Jeff, where can we find you?
Well, you can find me on my channel, Another Progressive Show, at youtube.com/JCWaldorf. So check out some of my videos there. I've got some hard-hitting commentary. And then you can find me on Twitter at Jeff's Politics. Yes, Jeff's Politics. And thank you, everybody, for watching.